Father God, we rely upon this platform of technology to communicate between one another right now. And Father, that is, to me, it's an awkward way to teach. So I pray that your Spirit be upon me and those in this class today, that we can interact with one another, specifically tonight in the book of Titus, that your Spirit will be upon us. Father, I pray that you will give us insight and wisdom and a real heart for wanting to know more about your will as we read these texts together tonight. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. Okay, I candidly admit that the least favorite thing that I probably have done during the pandemic era is do any type of teaching on platforms. I've held more meetings than I'd like to, and I didn't enjoy them that well, but this is our platform for now until we can come back together for our classes. Last week, Dennis did a good job covering an overview of the 3 books that we will be looking at this summer. And he mentioned the fact that he had sort of some rules of the road, you might say. One would be that we will not be able to follow questions in the chat arena. So if you're chatting a note to us, don't expect one of us to be able to pick up on it. There will be opportunity tonight, because one of the things that I picked up on from feedback was people would like to interact more. Now, last week I saw that most of the screens were black with the name of the people across it. So if you're going to interact today, unless you're on a phone, be sure and let us see your smiling face if you ask a question, just like my wife's trying to do right now, apparently. And so as we'll try to follow that rule. If you do have a question, if you can use the mechanical or technical feature of raising your hand, I'll try to pick up on it. But this screen right now is at least 2 full screens full of people, and I can't watch those, and the slides will cover most of my screen. So in any event, let's go ahead and move out. Let me pull up and share with you on the screen a PowerPoint that we're using the same sort of slides, but what I want to do is share. Okay, let me back up a little bit. Let's see if I can stop sharing for just a second. Reshare. Okay, tonight we'll be in Titus. We'll be dealing specifically with the passage, 2 passages, if we can get to them in our given amount of time. And the first part of the passage we'll look at, and then next week Lloyd will look at another passage or a series of passages in Titus. First part of the passage we'll look at will be in the opening chapter. That deals with chapter 1, verses 1 through 16. And then if we don't run out of time, we'll try to cover chapter 3, verses 12 through 15. And so as we move out today, just there'll be overlapping material between the books of Timothy and Titus. Today, because this is the first lesson actually in the text, I'm not going to try to cover too much over in Timothy at all. We'll do some cleanup as we go along to show some confluence and things with going on with the interaction between these books in terms of their content. Last week, as Dennis made his opening presentation to you, one of the things that he presented was the idea that this set of books, these 3 books, may have been written or submitted as a trilogy, that is, as a 3-part series of letters. And the first one that we are studying is being studied in this order because if there was in fact a trilogy, Titus is most likely the one that would have been first in that group. Both Titus and 1 Timothy, depending on where you come from in your scholarly background, would have been written about the same time. 2 Timothy would have been written later. So let me move through the slides with you. And as we open lesson 2, I want to fall back to the language of G. Campbell Morgan, a famous preacher from the 1863 period through 1945 when he passed away. And he said, if you want a revelation of what the mystery in the church really means, turn to Titus. An essential teaching, it's linked with the letter to Timothy. The background is Crete, and what a background it is. And so hopefully tonight we'll have time to move into the background of Crete, and there's some strong comments by the writer, in this case, be it Paul, or as was referred to last week, some people believe it's more of a pseudonym writer, Pastoral Paul, as some call it. I'll simply use Paul most of the occasions, and that pseudonym theory has been more in the last 100 years or so it's developed. Most of us were accustomed simply saying that Paul's the writer. So as we move through this, we'll keep in mind Morgan's comment that it is a very great revelation about ministry. So the body of this, it's only 46 verses in the entire letter, beginning to end, and it charges Titus to deal with bad behavior of certain Christian teachers in Crete. Titus 1:5 is sort of the first block, and Titus 3:16 ends the body of a charge that's given by Paul to the particular people that are believers on the island of Crete that Titus is working with. And verse 5 says, the reason I left you in Crete was that you put in order what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town as I directed you. The bookend of that is in chapter 3, our people must learn to devote themselves to doing what is good in order to provide for urgent needs and not live unproductive lives. Between those 2 bookends, you'll see that there's a lot of how to go about and instructions, and that's as to how to approach ministry, particularly at this point in time. In Titus 1:5, Paul had given previous instructions to Titus to accomplish certain things. So let me ask the question of you and see who might be willing to respond. So why would Paul give the same guidance again? If he's given previous instructions, why would he go about the process of giving them again?
I would think he's not doing it or to emphasize its importance.
Okay, one option would be that Titus is not carrying out the mission. The second, as Melissa mentions, is that it's such an important task or mission that bears additional emphasis. What else? There's other theories out there.
Could be just hard, and it hasn't all been done.
Okay,
he's been trying.
Well, since this is a letter that's being sent and it's expected to be read to various churches, that it's being put down in writing so that other people will know that it's something that's to be done as well. It's not just so that Titus will hear about it, but it's so that other people will know about it as well.
Okay, Lou, and that's one of in fact, some of the scholarly text should be quoting from you, because that's what they have proposed, and that is that this, especially if this was a trilogy, that it's not just written to deal with the issue of, the deal with the issue on Crete. It's trying to prepare those in future generations, future ministers that will be on the island of Crete, future church leaders, even beyond Titus. And so it's a broader group of people. That's another theory. What else?
Stuart, I would imagine that Paul wants to validate to the readers, as Lou has said, the authority that he's giving to Titus to do this. I mean, he's telling Titus to appoint elders. Titus can't just waltz in and say, hey, I'm going to do this. He needs that validation in writing from Paul. Okay.
And this is sort of his letters testamentary to carry out his mission, you might say. Okay. That's an approach. Might explain it. Any others? I think one just very realistic thing, Paul wasn't walking around with an Apple device. He may not have known what the status of these events that he had instructed Titus on. He may not even know what's going on. And I think Donis or Melissa mentioned that early on. And so it's not dealing with digits that are sent through 5G networks to find out what's going on here. And so he may not know the status, but he knows it's important. It's a mission that we cannot fail on. And so I think several of you have touched on the right answer, and that is he's giving this guidance. He may not know the status. He's been a long ways away from Crete at this point in time, and there's some dispute as to whether he ever actually went to Crete. So, this is a mission that's important to him, and he may not know the status of it. Okay, how do we find the intent or meaning of a biblical author for the audience of that message? And we're talking about a message that Paul sent to Titus on the island of Crete. Whether Paul was there, there's some theories that he went there. There's other theories that he never really was there, but he certainly knew Titus well. He knew Titus and Timothy well. And so how do we take and determine what Paul's intent was for the people in Crete, and particularly for the elders, the overseers, and for Titus, and apply it to our audience today? And one methodology that's often referred to is called crossing the bridge. That is the bridge between that group of people hearing the message and the group today that's listening to it as we listen to it on Zoom together. In fact, leads me to my next point. Meaning matters and words matter, and the intent of an author shapes the meaning of the words. So perhaps the ability to understand the intent of the authors in pastoral epistles is one of the most critical things that we can accomplish in the study of these texts. How can we determine what the intent is of Paul for Titus for then and what it means now? And when I think I have a typo on my slide, it's the intent of Paul for Titus. How can we determine that intent that he wanted to convey in these messages that he sent in this particular letter, in these short 3 chapters or 46 verses? How can we determine the intent for him and what it means for us today in today's setting? And that's going to be true particularly in the pastoral epistles as we study them. So let me walk you through some things that may help us as we approach that. Intent matters. I want to give you an example. John Lennon of the Beatles had a song that had a catchy phrase, "With a little help from my friends." You can raise your physical hand if you want to, if you remember that song. Had a catchy sort of tune to it, and everybody would walk around sort of humming or singing it. How many of you know what over the long haul was determined to be the intent of John Lennon when he referred to friends? What was friends defined as when he finally explained it? The little help from my friends. Some of you can probably hum the tune. No one? It turns out at the end of the day, friends were the drugs that he was advocating or using, okay? And so that changes a lot the meaning of what he meant with his song that he was singing. Scott Duvall and Daniel Hayes use this example in their book on grasping God's word. And it's a text that's a good, I'd say, beginner or mid-level scholar's text that helps you understand the intent of the author. And so let me show you what Duvall and Hayes suggest. And specifically, we'll talk about what they suggest for us as we study a letter from Paul in the New Testament. Duvall and Hayes suggest that frequently the reader today does not examine the author's intent, but instead applies what might be called reader response. The intent is determined by who? The reader in today's setting, or the community of readers. And by the way, Chess mentioned is How to Study the Bible class, that sometimes we need to have a community of readers. That sometimes that community of readers or the single reader simply interprets the intent of the author purely by their own understanding of it. And so what Duvall and Hayes suggest is you have to cross a bridge which we'll do to a degree tonight. That is the intent of the author from 2,000 years ago to understand Scripture in today's culture and identify its true meaning, and it will require some work and some skills to do it. What I give you here is a drawing, and I want to walk through it with you. There are 5 points on this drawing that Duvall and Hayes have in their book. Point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4, and point 5. My voice holds up. I've cited it. The actual text, the book by Duvall and Hayes, is only about $24, even in a hard copy version. I think their 4th edition came out last year, if I'm not mistaken. I've got an older edition. And you'll see over on the left side here, it looks sort of like Old Testament days, maybe New Testament days, but certainly not looking at the modern cities of Arlington or Alexandria here. Whereas the right side, over in 5, depicts a more modern context. And what we'll do together is let me walk you through these 5 touch points. The 5 steps are proposed as 5 steps to better understand an author's meaning in a New Testament letter, such as the Pastoral epistles. The first thing you do up here, and I'm going to skip down, is you've got to grasp the text in the author's town. Grasp the text in the author's town. And so what you'll see is up here, number 1 is a reference to the community that was receiving the letter or receiving the message. And you've got to grasp what the context, what the culture was, what the historical situation was. What were these people about? What was going on that would help us understand, in Titus's case, on the island of Crete? That's the first thing you do in your process of trying to grasp what God is communicating in this particular message. The second is you've got a river to cross. And you'll notice in that picture on the screen, there's a river that runs here. The width of that river may vary depending on if we're dealing with the Old Testament. We may be dealing with 3,000 or 4,000 years almost, that time period where we're having to reach back and try to understand, look at the patriarchs. We're trying to understand what they are listening to, what message they'd received from God as we read the Old Testament several thousand years before we live over here in number 5. And so that's a challenge. It should be a little bit easier with the New Testament days, but it's still a challenge. It requires the help of the Holy Spirit and certainly some real work and skill development on our part. The third thing, or the second thing, is then that you measure the width of the river that you've got to cross. What are the differences between the biblical audience, this one being Titus on Crete, and us? Okay, measure the width of that river. And the third thing is you must cross the principalizing bridge. And what does that mean? Well, it means that there's a theological principle or perhaps spiritual principle in the text, and it needs to cross the bridge over to the time period we're in today as we listen to the text. So you're trying to grasp the author's town or the author's audience town, measure the width of the river to cross. That is, how broad is this in terms of, is this the Mississippi River we're trying to cross with a bridge, or is it just a creek or a stream? And then we have to identify theological principles that we want to carry forward into our day today. And so the fourth step is to consult the biblical map. How does the theological principle fit within the rest of the Bible? And the last step, and I can't see it on my screen right here very effectively, but you must grasp the text at our town. How should Christians today live out the theological principle? The reason this is particularly true in the pastoral epistles is when you're talking about Titus receiving a letter from Paul on the island of Crete, there were unique circumstances. The same is true of Timothy as he's in Ephesus. Unique circumstances that we have to grasp and understand. So when we look at what's the theological principle that we want to bring forward, or the doctrinal principle, we have to carefully guard against bringing a principle that really has very little to do with our society with us, okay, into our society, imposing it on us, or vice versa. And so there's some real importance here in understanding these 5 steps that Duvall and Hayes talked about. So let me back up here. Number 1, we grasp it. We measure the width, okay, of the water that we've got across. Third, we have some theological principle or doctrinal issue that we want to bring across a bridge. We've got to take and look at number 4 and take the whole knowledge, our working knowledge of the Bible in context, and try to fit that theological principle in and carry it forward into our modern society and our setting. And in these very practical epistles, that can be challenging at times. I want you can snap a screenshot of that if you want to, but it's something we're going to use along the way as we work through this scenario over the next several months. Okay, the opening of the letter is, all of you've had it, you should have read the text most likely, and it has a standard Greco-Roman letter addressed by the author and the recipient, or the addressee, are both mentioned. But for this one, for a Pauline opening, the self-identification is greatly expanded. Only Romans is longer. He knew Titus well. So why the long opening? Why do you think he would take the time for this long opening compared to, only Romans is longer, compared to what he typically did in these other letters? What do you think the reason is? There's a couple up on the screen that you might consider.
I wonder if maybe people were sending false letters and he wanted to prove that it was really him.
All right. Great point to make. That's certainly worth a consideration. Because there were false teachers over there, so you don't know what they might have been doing. What else?
Well, I think it was Lou who said this is for the people who hear it who are not Titus. So it would be for them to, the Cretans to understand Paul better.
Okay. And the letter is aimed at younger ministers in future generations after Titus. So perhaps that's one major theory out there. The other is that this opening is a part of a 3-part trilogy of letters being sent to circulate among churches, specifically on the island of Crete. And if that's the case, Titus would be the first, or not just in Crete, but around the Asia Minor area there. Titus would be the first in the trilogy, most likely, and it has that nature as if it is the opening remarks. Timothy is much more detailed at times. So the 2 theories of being aimed at younger ministers and future generations is not inconsistent with the idea that be part of a trilogy. So that those 2 ideas are not inconsistent in any form or fashion. The overarching charge to Titus and any leader who reads the text in the church is found in verse 1-5, to correct what is lacking. That's the terminology used by Hudson, the writer that, the commentator that Dennis referred to last week. And the NIV says, the reason I left you in Crete was that you might put in order what was left unfinished and appoint elders in every town as I direct you. So we're talking about an overarching charge at the beginning of the book to correct what's lacking, or to put in order something that's unfinished, to appoint elders in every town. So I guess I pose this question to you in this frame of reference. If there's unfinished business, and what is it that the elders in every town are going to be about the business of doing, that why do they perform such a critical role in the message Paul has sent to Titus in this particular instance?
I didn't understand the question. I'm sorry.
Okay, and it's probably a poor one then. What is Paul expecting these elders to do that will deal with issues that they're confronted with that he wants put in order? Is it to take care of the budget? So often we get involved in budgets and other things as elders. Is that what they're going to be about? What's the action that they're going to engage in?
It's to make sure that there's sound teaching and that they're kind of speaking up against false teaching and I mean, that's part of it.
That's a good point, Mark, and that's right. He's got a set of false teachers out there that have been damaging the body of Christ on the island there, and so Paul wants the elders to address that issue. And we'll talk in a little bit about the concept of elders and overseers and some of the distinctions that some commentators have made, but that appears to be the primary task that they'll take on. Okay, so first Titus, in Titus 1:5, Paul had given previous instructions, so why is he giving the same guidance again? And we've answered that. So let's move here to look at Titus, and what you've got before you is, I don't know whether I missed a slide here or not, but in any event, 1 Timothy 3 has a list of very similar descriptive characteristics for elders and overseers, as Titus does. And this particular slide gives you a comparison. There are some that Timothy mentions that Titus does not. There's some that Titus mentions that Timothy does not. Look at that comparison. Without reproach, unimpeachable. What do you think unimpeachable means?
Without reproach.
There are
they don't lie.
Okay, good point. In fact, some commentators make reference to the fact that they are never caught in any type of setting where their words are inconsistent with their acts or their other words. Husband of one wife. How many of you have been a part of debates about that issue in your time? And yeah, see a lot of hands go up with that one. What do you think that really is referencing?
I think it's referencing a person who has multiple wives at one time.
Polygamy versus monogamy?
Yes, that's what I think it means.
Okay. Who else?
Faithful to his wife. However, I mean, it's whether there can have been divorce or not is the way it has arisen. In my knowledge, most of the time.
Yeah, historically, when elders are being selected, if there's an individual who perhaps was divorced 25 years earlier, then the issue is, was he divorced for quote unquote biblical reasons, and is he automatically disqualified because of having a second wife? That was the arguments I heard even as a child. Donna, you probably heard the same thing.
But there was one case when there was someone from a country where polygamy exists, whether there had been previous wives in that other country. So heard that too.
Well, I was in a congregation where an elder's wife died, and he resigned because he felt that he could not be an elder anymore because he no longer had a wife.
I've seen that happen as well. Anybody have any thoughts? What, literally, I heard one lesson that focused totally on this. And at the end of the day, the comment was made, it's a one woman man, okay? And it doesn't necessarily, it deals with the idea of marital fidelity. But let me ask this point. If you look at some of the admonitions that Paul has given, and the fact he's talking to the people in a really challenging environment here, could it be someone who's never married? Is this a commandment that it must be someone who's married, or simply that they've been faithful to the spouse that they're married to?
Sounds interesting to me.
Sounds that has to be married and has to have kids, because down in the bottom of the passage, speaking about kids not being accused of debauchery and rebellious. So it has to have wife and kids, and they got to be older enough to be faithful.
And that's the argument that I heard most of my life, that because it couldn't refer to a man who did not have a wife, because it was making reference to, because of the later reference to children, and children that he had managed well. How many of you agree with that? Anybody? Or
well, it's certainly what I've been taught all my growing up in churches of Christ. But it seems to me, of course, you could say this about Paul in a lot of cases, that if he had meant for elders to be married and have kids, he would have said it a heck of a lot more directly than he did. I mean, he could have said an elder needs to be married, an elder needs to have kids. He didn't say that. He said he needs to be the husband of one wife. And I think one is the important part there. So, you know, the polygamy thing, all of that. I think the sense is that if you have children, that they're not given to debauchery and all those other things. It's not very direct if he's telling us that an elder has to be married. And I know we've always insinuated that. I just don't think it's a very direct assertion, if that's what it means.
Well, and there are times where Paul talks about it's better for you to remain what? Single?
Single.
Yes.
So would he encourage someone to remain single and then take them out of leadership? Is there an inconsistency there?
I'm thinking about the household, because I've heard that discussed. If whether he's married or not, whether his wife dies or not, as long as he's a good manager of his household, then he will be a model for the household of the church.
Okay, so let's talk about something that was true in Greco-Roman society, and that is that on the island of Crete, which the Romans were never completely successful of imposing their culture totally upon the islanders there in Crete. It was a very strong culture. So it was always a Greco-Roman culture. In that culture, there's several things to be aware of. There were in certain location, number one, there was a rather, to me, inconsistent view, and this is ironic, I think, that there was a lot of debauchery and a lot of infidelity. But those who held themselves to a standard and were indeed a man of one woman during their entire life, it was really looked up to. Now, I'm not sure what the locker room talk was about the person behind the scenes, but the bottom line was that was something that was held in high esteem as almost aspirational. That's one factor. Additionally, I need to mention to you that as we talk about households, one of the things Titus would have found as he went to the island of Crete is that he would have found households that would have sometimes been a widow who had an entire household that she governed. Other times there would be households that men governed in cities. And so when you'll notice something in verse in Titus 1:7 that is somewhat of a unique movement that is referencing what? What's the term that's used in 1:7? Is it elder?
My translation has overseer.
Correct. So and that's what my New International Version has. Is there a distinction between an elder and an overseer? And this may require you to think a little bit about what Timothy says, because what's led to in some particular religious heritages is a distinction between an overseer and an elder. What do you think? Is there a distinction?
My Bible says the Greek word is elder for overseer.
Okay.
I mean, I have always been taught that the words for elder and overseer and pastor and bishop and shepherd were all referred to the same person or position in the Lord's church. I mean, I don't know that that's the truth, but that was what I was always told. And the word presbyter, that those all referred to the same position or office in the Lord's body.
Okay, and I pulled a commentary that was written by all Southern Baptist ministers or Southern Baptist theologians. And that particular commentary, which is respected, it referred to pastors, elders, and overseers, meaning the exact same thing, okay? Now, keep in mind, in most Southern Baptist churches, many of them have started to embrace the concept of elders, but generally it was the pastor or was served in that sort of role. And then they had deacons that did other things. But they clearly delineate that the words and the commentary I looked at said that this is the exact same term in each instance. However, there are, and I don't know if I can't tell, I assume Chess is on the line here, but there's a time period when things began to change in the 2nd century by 150-ish, and there was a group of individuals who would be what we would probably equate to be sort of an Episcopalian sort of background order. And what they suggested was that overseers were, like in the island of Crete, would have been perhaps an overseer of the entire city of all the elders there. And that was a regional or perhaps for a whole city versus the house churches where the elders were located. And that theory seemed to be one that developed a little bit further in time, not as close to the 1st century, but a little bit further in time. A couple of commentators suggest that over in 1 Timothy, there is a distinction between an overseer and an elder. And they make that argument that the overseer is over a broader group of individuals, perhaps over more than a house, more than a home, more than a home church, perhaps over a city. And if you think about that in today's society, in today's churches, what sort of structure would you envision if that was the case? It's not one we've embraced, but
bishops. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, you'd have a bishop or some
church.
What's that? I'm sorry.
I said it kind of sounds like the hierarchy in the Catholic Church.
Hierarchy in Catholic Church, Episcopal Church, right? Okay. The argument can be made. We won't worry about spending much time with it tonight. That over in Timothy, there is a distinction between an overseer and elder. Just be aware that that's out there. When you look at these qualities, we tend to use them as a checklist when we go to select elders, okay? So they've got to hit, every person's not, it's going to have to hit this checklist. Do you think that's really what Paul was telling Titus in the list you see on the left? Was he telling him these people have to check this box, make sure that, or is it something more than that that's going on?
Well, verse 7 says it must be blameless. So he can't have any major faults if he's blameless. Right?
You think major faults is what it is?
Yeah, I think it's looking at the character of the person that they want leading the church. If you are not a person of good character, how can you guide a people?
Okay.
It's more a portrait. It's almost a picture instead of a check off the box. Well, he's this, he's that, he's the other thing.
And why do you say that, Scott? Because you and I probably both grew up in churches where it was a checklist, right?
Absolutely was a checklist in the churches where I grew up. But again, I think because of the diversity in the church then and even now, you're looking for people of character. I think it's just some general guidance on the types of individuals that should be put in these roles.
Okay.
But how could a man who was really violating any one of those, be it greatly anyway, be a good elder? Couldn't get along with the other elders, wouldn't be a good example to the congregation.
And two, I mean, kind of the whole debate, about the marriage and so forth. I mean, it comes into play. I mean, in churches, I mean, you have people dealing with, the relationships with their families, with their spouses. And so I would see it as a good thing to have a married elder. I mean, it's, to me, you could say that how is a single elder, I mean, if an elder is single, never been married, how is he supposed to be relating to all of these people who are under him, who have families, have kids, and so forth?
I think that's one of the reasons we have more than one.
Yeah.
They all bring different gifts to the table.
So one of the problems here is if you only have married elders, there's a whole male married elders, and I am not advocating for something different from that at this point. But I will tell you that the art.
You're breaking up there, Claudia, for some reason.
I think they're frozen.
I'll give it up. Meet me there and I'll compare.
I'm not saying it's any more important than, I'm not saying that's any more important, but I mean, I'm saying that it is a good thing to be looking for.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think any of these can be overdone. I was once in a church where an elder in his 80s who had led an impeccable life resigned because one of his children in their 50s or something stopped going to church, which I thought was kind of taking on more than a man should have to bear, being responsible for an adult child who makes a decision later on in life.
Okay.
I think you're back, Claudia, by the way. You can see a movie now.
So what I was saying is, while I don't necessarily take this position, I do have friends who would point out that by only having married men, we limit the life experiences of people, and that part of the problem in the churches that have experienced substantial sexual harassment, etc., is that women are not comfortable coming to men to talk about it. And so, there is a set of thinking that we should not ignore that says this set of limitations causes problems in the church. And so certainly I would say to our elders, you should be aware and figure out how it is that you're going to figure out those problems when you don't have any experience of what it's like when somebody tries to put his hand up your skirt in church.
Well, I think I tend to look at myself as probably one of the more, I don't know how to quite say this, one of the more open-minded or more liberal members of the congregation in most ways. But I do tend to think one of the reasons that that you would have married elders and you would, to some extent, examine their wives as well as the elder as well, is because you do expect their wives to play a role in the eldership. I mean, that they may not officially have an office, if you consider eldership an office, but I think clearly, I certainly in my life as a Christian have gone to elders' wives for counsel, and I've gone to elders' wives to recommend that they speak with their husbands about matters that I might not have felt I wanted to go directly to the elder about. So while I personally do think that this is a matter that the words really mean what they appear to mean, literally that elders are to be male and that they are to be married, I think that the fact that they have wives, it has some significance in it itself.
Okay. If we flip real fast back to the 5 steps to better understand author's meaning in New Testament letter, think for just a minute, because we need to move on, this idea that we're trying to understand what Paul is writing to Titus about in the island of Crete and the issues that were there. Think about the width of the river that we've got to cross here for us to understand it fully, and what theological principles or doctrinal principles are in play here as we look at these descriptive words and lists, and how do they fit within the context of doctrine in general, theology that we embrace, and how does it move into our society and in our setting. And I think it's one that this is an example of where the steps of Duval and Hayes is beneficial, perhaps, as we study to look and use that particular model. So I just put that out there for you. Get forward here. Okay. So I've asked the question, we're almost out of time, aren't we? Do we have 2 lists, one describing elders, one's for overseers? I will tell you there is a fairly strong argument that's developed to support the idea that overseers may have had a different standard applied to them, even on the island of Crete. And we'll talk maybe more about it if we have some extra time one day. We're out of time right now. Don, you got your hand raised, is that right?
Instead of just jumping in.
Okay.
This just occurred to me. Was on Crete and in most of the Roman Empire at that time, was it pretty much standard that everyone got married at a fairly young age? Was almost everyone, at least initially, in a marriage relationship?
Yeah, what I read was, and I'm talking about reading from 3 or 4 different sources, would be that most people would be, but there was, of course, people's life expectancy was not as great, and that there was a problem with widows and with men who were without wives. So, you know, you had some situations develop, and that was not an uncommon issue. Does that make sense? Does that help you in that regard?
Well, it makes a difference looking at your diagram about this bridge. We have to go from one society to another society. In our society, it's certainly not standard that everyone marries young or that everyone marries.
Stuart, I know we've got to close, but I think it's important too to juxtapose those verses 5 through 9 with what follows in 10 through 16 about really what is the opposite of these traits or this portrait of what an elder is. And he's pretty straightforward in calling them beasts and gluttons and all this other stuff. But never mentioned there is they're single or that they, you know, don't have children or anything like that. So it's like it doesn't come up in the bad traits.
Well, and you're right, Scott. And one of the things I'm going to have to make up ground on either week after next or Lord will, and that is to next week, is to get into those negative traits, because there's a juxtaposition throughout this text in Titus between the things that elders should be doing and correcting. In fact, maybe a flip of the slide, that the opening and closing charge, I put it early in here. The reason I left you in Crete was to put things in order. And then there's this description in Titus 3, the second part of verse 8 through 11, where there's description of what you should not be engaged in and the warnings that you should provide. Don't get engaged in foolish controversies and genealogies and arguments. And so there's constantly, even in the charge that Paul gave in first part of Titus and at the end of Titus, is this constant between the people that ought to be about the business of wholeness to sound doctrine and heading us in the right direction toward godliness, and those who are about foolishness and debauchery and those types of things. And I'm going to have to figure out a way to come back at some point and wrap and deal with the concept of the Cretans and how strong the words really are about the Cretan culture. So, okay, any last questions before we move on? Dennis, I thought you had your hand up, but okay. Feel free, I'm going to put that map back. Does anybody want to take a screenshot of that there or a photo on your camera? You're welcome to. You may want to come back to it later as we go through the study.
Once I get back to where I actually have a computer, I will put these slides up on our website.
Good.
And Dennis's slides too, perhaps?
Yeah, I'm fine with that. I've already put them on the show.
Oh, yours were already there. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we'll get them up there.
I do want to say one thing though, before we finish. This whole thing makes me very nervous to get very close to saying we do things differently now because that was then and now is now. And so, you know, we just kind of do whatever we think is right now because, you know, the world is different now. I just, you know, I think we need to be really careful about saying, you know, the world is different, culture is different, and therefore the Bible doesn't really mean what it seems to say it means.
And Lou, I'll just make this one comment. The chart that I described for you infers a lot of rigor with the theological principles that you identified, and rigor at item number 4 as well, in terms of making sure it's consistent with God's will. And it's pretty easy when I'm rushing through this to sort of leave the impression that it's just a quick, this is a quick test. It's not. This is talking about a lot of rigor to go through the process of analyzing, you know, how you cross that river on a theological bridge. But your point's well taken. Okay, we appreciate the time. We're already past time, and rather than close us with prayer, I just ask, Lord, bless you and keep you safe this week, and may his face shine upon you.